The GPS coordinates led us deeper into the Appalachian foothills than I'd expected, past the point where cell service died and the hiking trails turned into deer paths. I kept checking my grandfather's compass pendant, stupid habit since we had actual navigation equipment, but something about these mountains made me want that extra reassurance. "Signal's holding steady," Georgia announced for the third time in 10 minutes, adjusting her receiver like she could fine-tune Stella's location through sheer willpower. She'd been obsessing over the equipment since we left the parking area, double-checking every connection and battery level. I got it. After what happened with her wolf pack in Montana, she needed this research to go perfectly. Pankaj dumped his pack next to a fallen log and wiped sweat from his forehead. "Remind me why we're hiking through deliverance country to track one bear when there are perfectly good populations near actual roads." "Because Stella's showing unusual movement patterns," Olivia said, not looking up from her satellite printouts. "And this area hasn't been studied since the 1980s. I already knew that. What I didn't mention was that my grandfather had been one of the last people to officially document anything here, back when he was investigating safety violations at the uranium mines. The Park Service files were thin on details about why he'd disappeared, but I'd read them all. We crested a ridge, and the valley opened up below us. Millbrook spread out like a broken toy set. Collapsed buildings, rusted equipment, and 3 mine shafts sealed with concrete barriers that looked newer than everything else. The whole place had this dead quality, like the forest had given up trying to reclaim it. Georgia's equipment beeped. "She's about 2 miles southeast of the main structures, still moving but slowly. Probably foraging," I said, though something about the bear's location bothered me. Why would she stay in the contaminated zone when there was plenty of food in the cleaner areas? Pankaj squinted at the ruins. "Please tell me we're not camping next to a radioactive ghost town. I'd like to keep all my hair. Thanks." "Radiation levels are within acceptable limits," Olivia said quickly. Too quickly. "We'll set up camp here on the ridge. Safe distance, good visibility." I watched her face as she stared at Millbrook. Most people looked at abandoned places with curiosity or mild unease. Olivia looked at it like she was calculating something. We found a clearing that met Georgia's extensive safety requirements: level ground, good drainage, clear sight lines in all directions. She checked for deadfall and widow makers, while Pankaj grumbled about carrying extra gear for someone else's bear paranoia. "Better paranoid than dead," Georgia muttered, testing guy line tension on her tent. The storm clouds had been building all afternoon, and now thunder rumbled in the distance. Not close enough to be dangerous, but enough to make everything feel more isolated. I pitched my tent between Georgia's and Pankaj's, creating our little research cluster while Olivia set up slightly apart, like she wanted to keep watch over both the camp and the valley. "First contact attempt tomorrow morning?" I asked, checking my own equipment. The radio collar tracker showed Stella's signal steady but stationary now. "Depends on the weather," Olivia said. "We'll reassess at dawn." Georgia had her sample collection kit spread across a tarp, organizing vials and testing strips with the kind of focus usually reserved for bomb disposal. Every piece of equipment had a specific place, a backup system, and a backup for the backup system. "You know, most bears just eat fish and berries," Pankaj said, watching her work. "They don't require a full hazmat protocol." "Contaminated environment requires contamination protocols," Georgia replied without looking up. "I'm not losing another data set to poor preparation." The light was fading fast now, turning the ruins below into a collection of dark shapes against darker shadows. I found myself studying the main street, trying to imagine it 40 years ago when my grandfather walked down there with his safety inspection clipboard and radiation detector. "Anyone else think it's weird how quiet it is down there?" Pankaj asked. Now that he mentioned it, yeah. No bird sounds, no rustling in the underbrush, nothing. Even the wind seemed to avoid the valley floor. "Mineral contamination affects local wildlife patterns," Olivia said. "Perfectly normal for a former mining site." Normal. Right. Except I'd read enough of my grandfather's notes to know that Millbrook had been anything but normal, even before he disappeared. We ate dinner from our camping stoves as full darkness settled in. The storm clouds blocked most of the stars, and the valley below disappeared completely. Georgia kept checking her equipment readouts. Battery levels, signal strength, GPS accuracy. Everything was working perfectly, which somehow made me more nervous than if something had been malfunctioning. "Early start tomorrow," Olivia announced, banking her stove's flame. "We'll track Stella's current position and see what's keeping her in this area." I settled into my sleeping bag and listened to my teammates rustling around in their tents. The thunder had moved off, but the air still felt charged, like the storm might circle back. Through my tent mesh, I could see the faint outline of the ruins below, darker patches against the dark valley floor. Something about this place felt familiar in a way that had nothing to do with maps or research papers. Like genetic memory, passed down from my grandfather through 40 years of family silence. I closed my eyes and tried to focus on tomorrow's research objectives, but my hand kept finding that compass pendant. In the distance, so faint I might have imagined it, I thought I heard the echo of footsteps on gravel. The sound hit me like ice water at 2:47 a.m. A low, melodic voice drifting up from the valley, singing something that made my skin crawl with recognition. Not because I'd heard the song recently, but because it was familiar the way childhood nightmares are familiar, buried so deep you can't quite place them until they surface at the worst possible moment. I lay there for maybe 30 seconds, hoping it was just my brain playing tricks after a day of thinking too much about my grandfather. But the voice kept going, carrying some old mining ballad through the still air between the ruins below and our ridge camp. A zipper sounded from Pankaj's tent, followed by his whispered curse. "You hearing this too?" "Yeah." I crawled out of my sleeping bag, grabbing my flashlight and jacket. "How long has it been going on?" 20 minutes, maybe more. Started real quiet, but it's getting louder." Pankaj had his rifle slung over his shoulder when he emerged from his tent. The guy who'd been making jokes about Deliverance Country all day suddenly wasn't taking any chances. The moonlight was strong enough to see by, but the singing made everything feel wrong, like we were trespassing on something private and dangerous. "Should we wake the others?" I asked, though I already knew the answer from his expression. "And tell them what? That we're spooked by some drunk local wandering around a ghost town?" He adjusted his grip on the rifle. "Let's just check it out. Probably nothing." We made our way down through the trees, trying to step carefully on the uneven ground. The singing got clearer as we moved closer to Millbrook's main street. Definitely a male voice, gravelly and rough, like someone who'd spent too many years breathing dust and cigarette smoke. The melody was one of those old worker songs, the kind my grandfather used to hum while he worked in his garage. That connection hit me harder than it should have. Grandpa had hummed constantly, usually stuff from his mining days, but I'd never paid close attention to the actual songs. Now, hearing something similar floating up from the place where he'd disappeared, I felt this weird vertigo, like the past 40 years had collapsed into nothing. The ruins looked different at night. During the day, they'd seemed sad and abandoned. Now they looked actively hostile, full of shadows that moved wrong and angles that hurt to look at directly. We crept along what used to be the main street, staying close to the broken sidewalk where our footsteps wouldn't echo on gravel. The singing was coming from near the old company store, a building that had lost most of its roof but still had walls standing. Through the moonlight, I could make out a figure standing with his back to us, wearing what looked like a miner's helmet with a light that wasn't turned on. He had on coveralls and heavy boots, and he was swaying slightly as he sang, like he was keeping time to music only he could hear. Pankaj pointed toward a pile of rubble we could crouch behind, maybe 20 feet away from the figure. We made it without making noise, but then Pankaj's boot came down on a branch that snapped like a gunshot. The singing stopped immediately. The silence that followed was worse than any noise could have been, complete and heavy, like the whole valley was holding its breath. The figure slowly turned toward us, moving with this deliberate calm that was absolutely terrifying. When his face caught the moonlight, I understood why Pankaj's hand had tightened on his rifle. The guy was gaunt to the point of looking sick, with hollow cheeks and skin that seemed too tight over his skull. But his eyes were the worst part. They reflected our flashlight beams like an animal's, throwing back this pale, silvery light that made him look more like a nocturnal predator than a person. He stared at us for maybe 10 seconds, though it felt like hours. There was something about his face that bothered me beyond just the general creepiness, something familiar that I couldn't quite identify. Like I'd seen him before, maybe in an old photograph or a half-remembered dream. Pankaj raised the rifle, not quite pointing it, but making it clear he was ready to. The figure watched this happen with no expression at all, then simply stepped backward into the shadows between the buildings. 1 second he was there, solid and visible in the moonlight, and the next he was gone like he'd never existed. We waited behind that rubble pile for 10 minutes, listening for footsteps or voices or any sign that he was still around. Nothing. Even the normal night sounds seemed muted, like the forest was afraid to make noise. "Think he's gone," Pankaj whispered. "I have no idea." We made our way back to camp without talking, both of us jumping at every shadow and sound. Only when we were back in the safety of our tent cluster did Pankaj lower his rifle. "That was not a drunk local," he said quietly. "No kidding." I wanted to ask if the guy had looked familiar to him too, but that seemed like the kind of question that would make me sound crazy. Instead, I just said goodnight and crawled back into my tent, though I knew sleep wasn't happening anytime soon. I lay there staring at the tent ceiling, trying to figure out why that face had seemed so familiar. The singing had definitely reminded me of my grandfather, but this was something more specific, like I'd seen that exact person before, maybe in one of the old family photos my grandmother kept in shoeboxes. When morning came and Georgia started her usual equipment checks while Olivia studied the weather forecast, neither Pankaj nor I mentioned our midnight encounter. What were we supposed to say? That we'd seen some creepy guy wandering around the ruins, singing old mining songs and disappearing into shadows like a ghost? Yeah, that would go over real well with our scientific expedition leaders. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever that was, he'd been expecting us. Dawn came gray and cold, with that heavy feeling you get when storms are still deciding whether to stick around or move on. I crawled out of my tent feeling like I'd maybe slept 2 hours total, which was probably optimistic. Pankaj emerged from his tent looking equally rough, and we exchanged one of those looks that said everything without saying anything. Georgia was already up, of course, running through her morning equipment check with the kind of intensity that suggested she'd been awake for a while. "Signal's still holding," she announced, though something in her voice made me look up from lacing my boots. "Still stationary?" I asked. "For the last 6 hours." "Exactly." She frowned at her receiver display. "Either the collars malfunctioned or—" She didn't finish the sentence, but we all knew what she meant. Bears didn't typically stay in one spot for 6 hours unless they were sick, injured, or dead. Olivia packed her gear with efficient movements, already dressed and ready to go. "We'll know soon enough. Weather's holding, so we should get moving." We followed her southeast through terrain that felt wrong in ways I couldn't quite pinpoint. The trees looked stunted, their leaves a sickly yellow-green that didn't match the season. Even the undergrowth seemed sparse and brittle, like the soil couldn't support normal growth patterns. "Mineral contamination," Olivia said when Pankaj commented on the vegetation. The runoff from the mining operations affected everything downstream. That made sense scientifically, but it didn't explain why the whole area felt hostile, like we were walking through something that actively wanted us gone. 2 hours in, Georgia stopped so suddenly that I almost walked into her. Holy shit. She was staring at a massive oak tree, its trunk scarred with claw marks that started about 8 feet up and ran down to the ground in deep, parallel gouges. Each mark was easily 3 inches wide and carved so deep into the wood that sap was still bleeding from the wounds. Pankaj circled the tree, rifle in hand. "Black bears don't get that high, and they sure as hell don't have claws this big." I ran my fingers along one of the gouges. The wood felt warm, almost feverish. and there was this smell like burnt metal that made my nose itch. Grizzly territory? Not in these mountains, Olivia said, though she was photographing the marks with the kind of focus that suggested she wasn't entirely surprised. Not for over a century. We found 3 more trees with similar damage over the next half-mile, each set of marks larger and more violent than the last. George's equipment was going crazy now, beeping constantly as we got closer to whatever was waiting for us. That's when Pankaj found the blood. It started as scattered drops on the leaves, dark and thick enough to still look wet despite the morning dew. The trail led us through a gap between 2 massive boulders into a clearing that made my stomach drop the second I saw it. Stella's remains were spread across 40 feet of open ground in a pattern that looked almost deliberate. Legs here, torso there, head positioned at the far edge like someone had arranged everything according to some sick blueprint. The GPS collar lay in twisted fragments near what used to be her neck, crushed so thoroughly that the metal looked like it had been put through an industrial shredder. "This isn't right," Georgia whispered, pulling on latex gloves with hands that shook so badly she could barely get them on. "Predators don't feed like this." She was right. I'd seen bear kills before, and they were messy but practical. Bears ate what they needed and left the rest. This looked surgical, like something had taken Stella apart piece by piece with medical precision. The trees around the clearing showed those same scorch marks we'd seen earlier, black streaks running down the bark like lightning burns. The soil had that metallic smell again, sharp and chemical in a way that reminded me of my grandfather's old Geiger counter when he'd let me play with it as a kid. Pankaj was studying the ground near the largest piece of the carcass. "Got human tracks here. Work boots, size 10 or 11, distinctive tread pattern." My skin went cold. "Leading which direction?" "Toward Millbrook." He followed the prints to the edge of the clearing where they disappeared onto rocky ground. Whoever it was, they were here recently, maybe last night. I stared at those boot prints and felt something click into place in my brain. The singing man from last night, standing in the ruins in his coveralls and heavy boots. Either he'd witnessed whatever did this to Stella, or he'd done it himself. Neither option made me feel any better about our situation. Georgia managed to collect tissue samples despite her shaking hands, sealing them in sterile containers with the methodical precision that had kept her sane through worse disasters. Olivia photographed everything from multiple angles, maintaining scientific protocol even though I could see the strain around her eyes. "We need to get back to camp," she said finally, checking her watch, "process what we found, and decide how to proceed." As we packed up the evidence, I couldn't stop thinking about those work boot prints and the way that singing man had looked at us in the moonlight, like he'd been expecting us to show up, like he knew exactly what we were going to find. That night, I tried to focus on organizing my field notes, anything to keep my brain occupied while we waited for whatever came next. Olivia sat at the edge of camp studying topographical maps, but I caught her glancing toward Millbrook every few minutes like she was expecting something. Pankaj cleaned his rifle for the 3rd time since dinner, which told me everything I needed to know about his state of mind. At 11:30, the singing started again. This time it was closer, definitely coming from the main street instead of the ruins' outskirts. The same gravelly voice, the same mining ballad, but now I could make out actual words. Something about going down, 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 where the sun don't shine. Pankaj was already reaching for his rifle when I grabbed mine. We didn't bother discussing it this time, just headed down through the trees with our flashlights off, letting the moonlight guide us. The sound of heavy boots on gravel echoed between the buildings, deliberate and unhurried, like whoever it was had all the time in the world. When we reached the main street, he was standing right there in the open, maybe 30 feet away. Same coveralls, same miner's helmet, but now he was facing us directly instead of having his back turned. Under the moonlight, I could see details that made my skin crawl. His face looked like someone had tried to put it back together after it got taken apart. Patches of skin that seemed too tight stretched over hollow cheeks, while other areas appeared almost translucent, showing dark veins underneath. The worst part was his smile. Several missing teeth created these black gaps, and his gums looked wrong, like they'd been burned or diseased. "Evening, boys," he said, his voice carrying that wet, rattling quality you hear in old men who've smoked too much and breathed too much dust. "Saw you poking around earlier. Find what you were looking for?" Pankaj kept his rifle ready but not quite aimed. "Depends what you think we were looking for." The man chuckled, a sound like gravel in a cement mixer. "Oh, I know exactly what you found. Poor old Stella. She picked a bad time to wander into the wrong territory." He gestured vaguely toward the sealed mine entrances. "Thing that got her ain't supposed to exist no more, but here we are." My throat felt dry. "You saw what happened to her?"
Didn't need to see it. Been watching this place long enough to know the signs. He stepped closer, and I caught a whiff of something metallic and chemical, like the smell from those burned trees around Stella's remains. "Name's Patricio Duran, though most folks just call me Bill. Been keeping watch over things since the mines shut down." "Keeping watch on what, exactly?" Pankaj's voice carried that edge he got when he was trying to stay rational in the face of something that didn't make sense. Bill's white eyes reflected our flashlight beams as he studied us. "You boys seem smart enough. College educated, I'm guessing. You figure it out." He pointed toward the concrete barriers sealing the mine shafts. "They didn't close those mines because the uranium ran out. They closed them because they dug up something that should have stayed buried." I found myself thinking about the work boot prints we'd found around Stella's body, the distinctive tread pattern that had led toward Millbrook. "How do you know about the bear?" "Told you, I keep watch. Part of the job." Bill's grin revealed more of those blackened gums. "But I ain't the one you need to worry about. That thing down there, it only comes up every few days to feed. Tonight feels hungry, if you know what I mean." Pankaj shifted his grip on the rifle. "What thing? Be specific." "Something that got changed by what they dug up down there. Radiation'll do strange things to living tissue, but this was something else entirely. Something that ain't quite animal, ain't quite something else." Bill's voice dropped to a whisper, "And it's getting stronger." The way he said it made my blood feel cold. This wasn't local folklore or ghost stories. Bill was talking about something real and dangerous, something that had torn apart a 400-pound black bear like she was made of tissue paper. "You need to pack up and get out of here," Bill continued, shuffling backward toward the ruins. "Take your friends and your fancy equipment and don't look back. Some places ain't meant for visitors." "Wait!" I called out, but he was already disappearing between the buildings, his miner's helmet light creating weird shadows on the broken walls. "How did you know we found Stella if you weren't there?" His voice echoed back from somewhere in the darkness. "I told you, son. I keep watch. It's what I do." Then he was gone, leaving us standing alone in the middle of Millbrook's main street, with more questions than answers, and the distinct feeling that we were being observed by something much worse than a lonely old man who'd spent too many years breathing toxic air. Pankaj lowered his rifle slowly. "That guy knows way more than he's telling us." "Yeah." I stared at the place where Bill had vanished. "Question is, what's he trying to protect us from?" We made our way back to camp without talking, both of us jumping at shadows and sounds that probably weren't there. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Bill's warning had been genuine, or that whatever had killed Stella was still out there, waiting for the right moment to show itself. And based on what Bill had said about tonight feeling hungry, that moment might be coming sooner than any of us were ready for. The walk back to camp felt like it took forever, both of us checking over our shoulders every few steps. By the time we reached our tents, I'd already made up my mind about what we needed to do next, even though the rational part of my brain was screaming that it was a terrible idea. "We're going into those mines tomorrow," I announced as we reached the others. Georgia looked up from her equipment case, where she'd been obsessively reorganizing the same sample vials for the third time since dinner. "Are you completely insane? That place is contaminated. We don't have proper protective gear for... Bill said something's down there. Something that killed Stella. I pulled out my grandfather's compass, watching the needle swing erratically in directions that had nothing to do with magnetic north. We need to know what we're dealing with. Pankaj set down his rifle and stared at me like I'd suggested we juggle live grenades. The crazy mining guy who appears and disappears like a ghost told us to leave, and your response is to go exploring radioactive tunnels. That's your plan? It's not about Bill. Though honestly, the way he'd talked about my grandfather was eating at me. Some people get absorbed by it, he'd said. What the hell did that mean? We're scientists. We don't run away from contaminated sites. We study them, figure out what's wrong, and document our findings. Olivia had been quiet this whole time, studying her topographical maps with that calculating expression I was learning to recognize. Finally, she looked up at me, and I saw something in her eyes that might have been resignation. I've been researching Millbrook's history, she said slowly. The mining operations, the uranium extraction, why they shut everything down so suddenly. Georgia stopped reorganizing her vials. You've been researching it? Since when? Since before we got here. Olivia folded her map with precise movements. The official records say they closed the mines in 1983 due to depleted ore reserves and environmental concerns. But the geological surveys from the 1970s showed significant untapped deposits. They abandoned billions of dollars worth of uranium for reasons that don't appear in any public documentation. Pankaj leaned forward. So, what really happened? Workers started reporting unusual incidents, equipment malfunctions, strange sounds from the deeper tunnels, animals behaving aggressively near the mine entrances. Olivia's voice carried the tone of someone reciting facts they wished weren't true. 3 miners disappeared completely. The company blamed cave-ins, but search teams never found any bodies or evidence of structural collapse. My skin felt cold. When did the disappearances happen? Between 1982 and 1983. The last one was a safety inspector named... She consulted her notes. Hiroshi Sanders. The compass slipped from my fingers and hit the ground with a metallic clink. Hiroshi Sanders. My grandfather's name. Kazuki? George's voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. Are you okay? I picked up the compass, trying to keep my hands steady. That was my grandfather. He disappeared investigating these mines 40 years ago. The silence stretched between us, heavy with implications none of us wanted to voice. Finally, Olivia nodded, like she'd been expecting this revelation. That's why you're here, she said quietly. Not just for the bear research. You've been looking for answers about your family. Maybe. I met her eyes. And maybe that's why you picked this location. You knew about the connection. She didn't deny it, which told me everything I needed to know about how much she'd been hiding from us. Look, Pankaj said, breaking the tension. Family mysteries aside, going into radioactive mines without proper equipment is suicide. Even if there's something down there, we'll be dead from radiation exposure before we find it. The concrete barriers have gaps, Olivia said, surprising all of us. Erosion from 40 years of weather. The entrance to the main shaft is accessible if you know where to look. Georgia stared at her. You've been down there already. Preliminary survey only. Radiation levels are elevated but not immediately lethal with limited exposure. Olivia's matter-of-fact delivery made it sound like she was discussing weather patterns. We'd need to limit our time underground and monitor exposure carefully. This is insane, Pankaj muttered, but he was already checking his equipment like he'd accepted the inevitable. We spent the rest of the evening planning the descent. Georgia compiled every piece of detection equipment we had: radiation monitors, electromagnetic sensors, air quality meters. Pankaj insisted on bringing his rifle, despite my pointing out that bullets wouldn't do much good against radioactive contamination. Maybe not, he said,
cleaning the barrel for the 4th time. But after seeing what happened to Stella, I'm not going anywhere without firepower. I couldn't argue with that logic. The next morning dawned gray and humid, with storm clouds building on the horizon. We made our way down to Millbrook's Main Street, following Olivia to the largest of the sealed mine entrances. The concrete barrier looked solid from a distance, but up close I could see the gaps she'd mentioned, places where decades of freeze-thaw cycles had cracked the cement, creating openings just wide enough for a person to crawl through.
"Radiation levels are elevated but manageable," Georgia announced, checking her detector. "We should limit exposure to 30 minutes maximum." Olivia went first, squeezing through the largest gap with the confidence of someone who'd done this before. I followed, and the temperature dropped about 20 degrees the moment I passed through the barrier. The main tunnel stretched ahead into darkness, supported by rotting timber posts that looked like they might collapse if you looked at them wrong. Our flashlight beams revealed rail tracks disappearing into the black, and the air tasted metallic and wrong, like breathing through a mouthful of pennies. "Jesus," Pankaj whispered behind me. "How deep does this go?" "The original survey maps show the main shaft extending almost 2 miles into the mountain," Olivia said, her voice echoing strangely in the enclosed space. "Multiple levels, with connecting tunnels and equipment chambers." Georgia's electromagnetic sensor was beeping constantly now, picking up readings that made her frown at the display. "This is weird. I'm getting massive electromagnetic interference, but it's not consistent with standard radioactive decay patterns." We'd gone maybe 50 yards when I spotted something that made me stop dead. Sitting on a wooden crate beside the tracks was an old Geiger counter, its yellow metal case dented and scratched but still intact. Holy shit. I picked it up carefully, recognizing the model from pictures in my grandfather's papers. The needle jumped immediately to the red zone, clicking rapidly in that familiar sound that meant danger. "That's vintage equipment," Olivia observed. "Has to be at least 40 years old." I turned the device over and found what I was looking for. A piece of masking tape with H. Sanders written in my grandfather's careful handwriting. My hands started shaking so badly I almost dropped it. "He was here," I said, my voice barely audible over the Geiger counter's clicking. "My grandfather was in this exact spot." The implications hit me like a physical blow. 40 years ago, my grandfather had walked into these tunnels carrying this same device, investigating the same contamination we were documenting now. But according to the readings, the radiation levels hadn't decreased like they should have after 4 decades. If anything, they seemed to be getting stronger the deeper we went. "Guys," Pankaj called from ahead where he'd been scouting the tunnel. "You need to see this." We found him standing beside a side chamber that had been carved out of the rock, lit by our flashlights in a way that revealed details I immediately wished I hadn't seen. Someone had been living down here recently. Empty food cans, a makeshift bedroll, personal items scattered around like a campsite. But not just any someone. The work boots beside the bedroll had the same distinctive tread pattern we'd found around Stella's remains. "Bill's been living down here," I said, the pieces clicking into place. "That's why he knows so much about what's happening. He's not just watching from the outside, he's been staying right here in the contaminated zone." Georgia was taking readings with her equipment, her face pale in the flashlight glow. "Radiation levels in this chamber are off the charts. No one could survive extended exposure to this much contamination." "Unless they'd already been changed by it," Olivia said quietly. We stood there processing that horrifying possibility when Georgia's electromagnetic sensor started going crazy, beeping so rapidly it sounded like an alarm. She held it up, following the signal deeper into the chamber, toward a tunnel entrance we hadn't noticed before. "The readings are coming from down there," she whispered. "Whatever's causing the electromagnetic interference, it's deeper in the mine." That's when we heard the scratching. It started as a soft, scraping sound, like fingernails on stone, echoing up from the darker tunnels below. But as we listened, it got louder and more rhythmic, like something large was moving through the passages with deliberate purpose.
"Time to go," Pankaj said, raising his rifle. We didn't argue. The four of us backed out of the chamber, then half ran, half stumbled through the main tunnel toward the entrance, my grandfather's Geiger counter clicking frantically the entire way. The scratching sound followed us, staying just at the edge of our hearing but never getting closer, like whatever was making it wanted us to know it was there. When we finally squeezed through the concrete barrier and emerged into daylight, all of us were breathing hard and sweating despite the cool air. Georgia immediately checked our radiation exposure levels while Pankaj kept his rifle trained on the mine entrance. Exposure was within acceptable limits, Georgia announced, though her voice shook slightly. But those electromagnetic readings were unlike anything I've ever seen. Whatever's down there, it's not just radioactive contamination. I stared at the Geiger counter in my hands, my grandfather's handwriting still visible on the faded tape. The needle had finally dropped back to normal levels, but the damage was done. I'd found proof that he'd been here, in this exact spot, investigating the same mysteries that had drawn us to Millbrook. The question was, what had happened to him after he'd left this device behind? "We should get back to camp," Olivia said, checking her watch. "Process what we've found and decide our next steps." As we walked back toward the ridge, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the mine entrance. Not Bill this time, something else. Something that had been waiting in the deeper tunnels for 40 years, growing stronger instead of weaker, feeding on whatever corruption had been disturbed when the miners dug too deep. And based on what we'd just seen, I was starting to think my grandfather hadn't just disappeared. He'd been absorbed by it, just like Bill had said. The only question was whether the same thing was going to happen to us. Pankaj insisted on taking first watch, and honestly, after everything we'd seen in the mines, I wasn't going to argue with the guy who'd brought the rifle. He positioned himself at the edge of our camp with his back to a big oak tree, radio clipped to his vest and weapon across his lap, like he was expecting trouble. 4-hour shifts, he'd said, checking his watch. "Wake me at 7 if nothing happens." I'd crawled into my sleeping bag around 11, but sleep wasn't happening. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my grandfather's handwriting on that Geiger counter, heard the scratching sounds echoing up from the deeper tunnels. The implications kept circling through my brain like water down a drain. He'd been here, in those exact tunnels, probably investigating the same electromagnetic readings that had sent Georgia's equipment crazy. At 3:15 a.m., Pankaj's screams cut through the night like a chainsaw. I was out of my tent before I was fully awake, stumbling toward his position with my flashlight sweeping wildly through the trees. Georgia and Olivia emerged from their own tents, both looking like they'd been yanked from nightmares. "Pankaj!" I called out, but the screaming had already stopped, replaced by a silence that felt thick and wrong. We reached his watch position and found nothing. Not nothing. Worse than nothing. His rifle lay on the ground in pieces, like something had grabbed the barrel and twisted it into scrap metal. His radio was smashed flat against the oak tree, plastic fragments scattered across the roots. Dark stains covered the leaves and undergrowth, too much blood for anyone to lose and keep walking. "Oh God," Georgia whispered, playing her flashlight over the scene. "Oh God, oh God." Olivia knelt beside the largest bloodstain, her expression grim. "There's a trail. It leads toward the valley." I followed her light beam and saw what she meant. Broken branches, torn fabric caught on thorns, and those dark drops leading downhill like breadcrumbs in a fairy tale nobody wanted to finish reading. We followed the trail through the trees, none of us talking because what was there to say? Every few yards we found more evidence. A piece of Pankaj's shirt, a boot print in soft earth, always leading toward Millbrook like whatever had taken him was heading home. The trail ended in the town square, right in the middle of that dead space where nothing grew. What we found there made Stella's remains look merciful by comparison. Pankaj was spread across maybe 60 feet of open ground, arranged with that same surgical precision we'd seen before. his legs positioned at perfect right angles, torso centered like the focal point of some twisted mandala, head placed at the far edge facing back toward our camp. Everything laid out according to rules that made sense to something, just not to anything human.
"This isn't possible,"
Georgia said, her voice shaking so badly I could barely understand her.
"No animal does this. No animal could do this."
She was right. Bears killed to eat or defend territory. Mountain lions were efficient predators, not artists. Whatever had done this understood geometry and took pleasure in displaying its work. Olivia was photographing everything with mechanical precision, her camera flash creating these horrible freeze-frame images of what our teammate had become. But her hands weren't steady, and I could see sweat beading on her forehead despite the cool night air. I made myself walk the perimeter, documenting details because that's what my grandfather would have done, what any researcher would do when faced with evidence that shattered everything they thought they knew about the natural world. The twisted rifle, and it was definitely twisted, metal bent into impossible spirals like it had been heated and reshaped by hand. Burn marks in the dirt around each piece of Pancade's body, perfect circles that looked like someone had pressed hot metal against the ground.
"Guys,"
Georgia called from where she was kneeling near the largest blood stain.
"Come look at this."
She'd pulled out her UV light and was scanning the area around Pankaj's torso. Under the purple glow, something showed up that we couldn't see with regular flashlights. A substance that glowed pale green, smeared across the ground in patterns that might have been symbols or might have been random. It looked organic but wrong, like phosphorescent algae that had been mixed with motor oil. "What the hell is that?" I asked. "I have no idea." She scraped some into a sample vial, her movements jerky and nervous. "It's not in any of my reference materials. The chemical composition is unlike anything I've documented before." That's when I heard the breathing. Not human breathing, something deeper and more deliberate, like the sound a large animal makes when it's trying to stay quiet but can't quite manage it. Coming from the ruins behind us, somewhere in the maze of collapsed buildings and rusted equipment. We all heard it. Olivia's camera stopped clicking. Georgia's UV light went dark. Even the night sounds that had been starting to return after our arrival cut off completely. "We need to leave," Olivia said quietly. "Right now." Nobody argued. We backed away from Pankaj's remains, keeping our flashlights pointed toward the ruins where that breathing continued, slow and patient like whatever was making it had all the time in the world to wait for us to make a mistake. The walk back to camp felt like it took hours, though my watch said we'd been gone less than 30 minutes. Every shadow could have hidden something watching us. Every sound might have been footsteps keeping pace just outside our light beams. When we reached our tents, Olivia immediately started pulling equipment from her pack. "We're leaving. Pack essentials only. Water, food, first aid kit. Abandon everything else."
"What about our research?" Georgia asked, still clutching her sample vials like they could anchor her to a world that made sense. "Forget the research. We're heading for the logging road." I grabbed my grandfather's compass and the Geiger counter, shoving them into my pack along with water bottles and energy bars. Georgia packed her samples and basic testing equipment while Olivia dismantled the camp with military efficiency, destroying anything that might identify us or explain why we'd been here. "What about the radio?" I asked, remembering our communication equipment. Olivia held up a handful of smashed components. "All of it's destroyed. Same pattern as Pankaj's rifle. Twisted metal, electronics fried beyond repair." The implications hit me like cold water. Whatever had killed Pankaj hadn't just been violent. It had been methodical, eliminating our ability to call for help with the same surgical precision it had used to arrange his body. We started hiking north toward the logging road just as the first pale light of dawn began filtering through the canopy. 5 miles of rough terrain, but it was our only connection to civilization and whatever passed for safety, in a world where things could tear apart armed men and arrange the pieces like art installations. We'd made it maybe half a mile when the crashing started behind us. Something large was moving through the forest, breaking branches and displacing undergrowth with each step. but it wasn't trying to catch us. It was following at a distance, matching our pace like a predator that wanted us to know we were being hunted. "Don't look back," Olivia ordered when Georgia started to turn around. "Just keep moving."
Every few minutes, the crashing would stop, leaving us walking in silence that felt worse than the noise. Then it would start again, always from a slightly different direction, like whatever was following us was circling around to get a better angle or just reminding us that it was still there. We hiked through the growing daylight with that sound stalking us through the trees, none of us talking because we were too scared and too tired and too focused on putting distance between ourselves and whatever had turned our expedition into a nightmare. My pack felt like it weighed 100 pounds. Georgia kept stumbling over roots and rocks. Even Olivia, who'd seemed unshakable throughout this whole mess, was breathing hard and checking over her shoulder despite her own orders not to look back. By the time we reached the logging road, the sun was fully up, and we were all running on adrenaline and desperation. The gravel under our feet felt like the most beautiful thing I'd ever experienced. A connection to the human world, to roads and vehicles and people who'd never heard of Millbrook or ancient things buried beneath uranium mines. We collapsed beside the road, too exhausted to celebrate our escape, knowing that something had spent the last 5 miles demonstrating that it could have caught us any time it wanted, but had chosen to let us go. The question was why. The sound of an engine grinding through gravel made me look up from where I'd been staring at my boots, trying to process the fact that we'd actually made it out alive. Through the heat shimmer rising off the logging road, a pickup truck was rattling toward us. Ancient rust-colored Ford that looked like it had been held together with duct tape and stubbornness for the last 30 years. The truck wheezed to a stop about 10 feet away, engine coughing like it was on its last breath. Behind the wheel sat a figure I recognized, but wished I didn't. Bill looked different in daylight. Worse, if that was possible. What I'd taken for shadows and weird lighting during our midnight encounters turned out to be actual damage to his face. His skin had this waxy, partially melted quality, like plastic that had been held too close to a flame. Patches of it were so thin they were almost translucent, showing dark veins underneath that pulsed with something that wasn't quite blood. His eyes had gone completely white, not just the irises, but everything, like cataracts had grown over his entire eyeball. "Get in the truck bed," he called out, his voice carrying that same wet, rattling quality but somehow more urgent. "All of you, right now." Georgia was still clutching her sample vials, staring at Bill like he was something she'd discovered under a microscope. "Who is that? How did he know where to find us?" "That's Bill," I said, hauling myself to my feet with muscles that felt like they'd been beaten with hammers. "The guy from Millbrook, the one who's been trying to warn us." Olivia was already moving toward the truck, her pack slung over her shoulder. "We need transportation. Questions can wait." "No way." Georgia shook her head. "Look at him. He's sick or contaminated or something. We can't—" "It's coming," Bill interrupted, and something in his tone cut through every objection Georgia might have had. "You can see the road from here, right? Open ground, nowhere to hide. It'll catch your scent before you make it a quarter mile." I helped Georgia to her feet, grabbed her pack when she almost dropped it. "Coming from where?" Bill jerked his thumb toward the forest behind us. "Same place it's been following you since you left camp. Same place it took your friend." His white eyes seemed to focus on me specifically. "Same place it got your grandfather 40 years ago." The words hit me like a physical blow. I'd been expecting this conversation since I'd found the Geiger counter, but hearing it confirmed made everything real in a way that hurt. "You knew him," I said. It wasn't a question. "We'll talk when you're safe. Right now, get in the damn truck." The three of us climbed into the truck bed, which smelled like motor oil and something chemical I couldn't identify. Bill gunned the engine, and we lurched forward, gravel spraying behind us as the old Ford accelerated with more speed than it had any right to possess. The ride was brutal. Every pothole felt like it was trying to throw us out, and the truck's suspension had apparently given up sometime during the Carter administration. but I didn't care about the discomfort. All I could think about was what Bill had said about my grandfather. 40 years ago, I called over the engine noise, leaning toward the cab. You were there when he disappeared. Bill adjusted his rearview mirror so I could see those white eyes looking back at me. I was the last safety inspector at Millbrook. Your grandfather was investigating violations, radiation exposure, improper storage protocols, that kind of thing. Company was cutting corners, endangering workers. What really happened to him? Bill was quiet for so long I thought he hadn't heard me over the engine. Then, you found his Geiger counter down there, didn't you? In the main tunnel. My throat felt dry. Yeah. He was documenting radiation levels in the deeper shafts when we discovered the uranium wasn't naturally occurring. It was protecting something. Something that had been buried under the mountain for a very long time. Georgia had been listening to this conversation with growing confusion. Protecting what? Uranium doesn't protect things. It's just a radioactive element. Tell that to whatever's been living beneath Millbrook since before humans learned to make fire. Bill took a turn that threw all of us against the side of the truck bed. The miners dug too deep in 1982, broke through into chambers that weren't made by water or geological activity, found things that shouldn't exist. The truck hit another pothole and my teeth clicked together hard enough to draw blood. What kind of things? The kind that rearrange bodies like art projects, the kind that grow stronger instead of weaker when exposed to radiation. Bill's voice dropped to barely audible over the engine. The kind that change people instead of killing them outright. He gestured to his face with one hand while steering with the other. This is what 40 years of exposure does to you. The radiation should have killed me decades ago, but the entity keeps me alive, keeps me human enough to serve as a warning system. I stared at his deteriorated features and felt sick understanding wash over me. You've been guarding the place. That's why you're always there, why you know everything that happens. Someone has to. Other investigators show up every few years. Researchers, hikers, treasure hunters who've heard stories about abandoned uranium. They go missing or they leave changed, and the thing beneath gets stronger. Olivia had been quiet this whole time, but now she leaned forward. How many others have you seen? Dozens over the years. Most I can scare away with stories about radiation poisoning and unstable tunnels. The persistent ones. He shrugged. Well, you saw what happened to your friend. The highway appeared ahead of us, blessed asphalt stretching toward civilization. Bill slowed the truck as we approached the intersection, and I could see a gas station about half a mile up the road. What about my grandfather? I pressed. You said he got absorbed by it. What does that mean? Bill pulled onto the highway, the truck's engine finally settling into something resembling normal operation. Some people it kills and rearranges, others it changes, like me. And some, he met my eyes in the mirror again. Some it takes completely, absorbs them into itself, uses their knowledge and memories. Your grandfather was documenting everything when it happened, every measurement, every observation about the entity's behavior. The gas station was getting closer, its bright signs promising hot coffee and normal human problems like credit card readers and price per gallon. It learned from him, I said, the pieces clicking together in ways I didn't want to understand. That's why it's so methodical now, why it arranges bodies with surgical precision. Your grandfather was a careful man, precise. The entity inherited those qualities when it absorbed him. Bill pulled into the gas station and parked beside the building. It's been using his methodical approach to study everyone who comes to Millbrook since then. We climbed out of the truck bed on shaking legs. Georgia immediately headed for the store, probably to call for help or just get away from this conversation. Olivia lingered near the truck, her expression unreadable. What do we tell people? I asked Bill. About Pankaj, about what we saw down there. Bear attack. Drought conditions making predators more aggressive. That's what the official report will say anyway. Bill's white eyes seemed to bore into me, The truth would just bring more victims, more researchers who think they can study something that's been learning how to kill people for 40 years. And if we don't stay quiet, then you'll be back, all of you. Something will draw you back to Millbrook, and next time I won't be able to help." He put the truck in gear. "Your grandfather's still down there in a way, part of the entity now. He'd want you to stay away." Bill drove off without another word, leaving us standing beside a gas station that felt like the most normal place in the universe. Cars passing on the highway, people buying snacks and filling up their tanks, completely oblivious to the fact that something ancient and hungry was feeding in the mountains less than 20 miles away. I watched his truck disappear around a bend in the road and realized I was holding my grandfather's compass again, the needle pointing steadily toward Millbrook like it always had. Some secrets are meant to stay buried, but they call to us anyway. I put the compass in my pocket and followed Georgia into the store to start lying about what had killed our friend. Inside the gas station, fluorescent lights buzzed over rows of candy bars and energy drinks like nothing had changed, like we hadn't just spent the last 6 hours running from something that rearranged human beings for sport. The normalcy felt almost violent, people buying coffee and lottery tickets while I stood there trying to figure out how to lie about watching my teammate get torn apart by something that shouldn't exist. Georgia was already at the payphone near the restrooms, her hands shaking so badly she kept dropping quarters. I could hear fragments of her conversation through the store's background noise. Emergency evacuation, and missing team member, and immediate response required. Her voice cracked on every other word. Olivia moved past me toward the counter, her phone already pressed to her ear. She was talking to someone at the Park Service, her tone professional and controlled in a way that made my skin crawl, like she'd done this before. "Wildlife incident at the Millbrook research site," she was saying. "1 fatality, 3 survivors requiring medical evaluation. We need immediate helicopter extraction and a containment team for the area." Containment team. Not search and rescue. Containment. I bought a Coke I didn't want and tried to process what Bill had told me about my grandfather. Absorbed by the entity. Part of it now. Using his methodical approach to study victims. The pieces fit together in ways that made me want to throw up, but they fit. My grandfather had always been precise about everything. His tools organized by size, his garden planted in perfect rows, even his handwriting measured and careful. If something had absorbed those qualities along with his consciousness, if it was using his systematic nature to become a more efficient predator. The Coke tasted like metal and regret. 20 minutes later, emergency vehicles started arriving. First, the county sheriff, then an ambulance, then a helicopter that landed in the gas station parking lot like something out of a movie. The EMTs checked us over. Dehydration, exhaustion, minor cuts and scrapes from our panicked hike through the forest. Nothing that suggested we'd encountered anything worse than rough terrain and bad weather. The sheriff took our statements separately. I told him we'd been tracking a radio-collared bear when Pankaj went missing during his watch shift. Found evidence of a large predator attack in the morning. No, we hadn't seen what killed him. Yes, the area had seemed unusually quiet, like other wildlife was avoiding something. All true, technically, just not the whole truth. George's story matched mine, though she kept breaking down in the middle of sentences. The sheriff seemed to interpret this as normal trauma response rather than someone struggling to avoid mentioning phosphorescent substances and geometric body arrangements. Olivia's account was perfect, detailed enough to seem credible, vague enough to avoid uncomfortable questions. She mentioned unusual animal behavior patterns and recommended the area be temporarily closed to civilian access until wildlife management could assess the situation. 3 hours later, we were in a Park Service facility 40 miles away, giving more detailed reports to officials who nodded sympathetically and took careful notes. The helicopter crew that had gone to retrieve Pankaj's remains came back grim-faced, confirming that large predator attacks could be particularly brutal during drought conditions when normal food sources were scarce. Aggressive behavior patterns, one of them explained to the assembled officials. Bears and mountain lions get desperate, start taking risks they normally wouldn't. Attacking humans becomes more likely. I wanted to ask if they'd seen the geometric arrangement, the burn marks, the twisted metal. But Olivia caught my eye and shook her head almost imperceptibly. The official report, when it came out a week later, blamed Pankaj's death on aggressive wildlife behavior consistent with drought stress responses in large predators. Millbrook remained off-limits to civilians due to ongoing radiation concerns and unstable wildlife patterns in the recovery zone. Case closed, file archived, nothing to see here. Georgia discovered her tissue samples had vanished sometime during the evacuation. The sample vials were still in her pack, but they were empty, not just lacking biological material, but completely sterile, like they'd been chemically cleaned to remove every trace of whatever she'd collected. Her testing equipment showed similar problems. Data files corrupted beyond recovery, electromagnetic readings wiped from memory cards, even her handwritten notes had somehow become illegible. The ink faded to nothing. "It's not possible," she kept saying, staring at pages that should have contained detailed observations, but now showed only blank paper. Ink doesn't just disappear. Data doesn't corrupt in solid-state drives. But it had, and we all knew why, even if we couldn't say it out loud. Olivia transferred to a research facility in Colorado 2 weeks after we got back. No forwarding address, no goodbye, just gone one day like she'd never existed. When I tried calling the Park Service to reach her, they told me no one by that name had ever worked in their wildlife division. That scared me more than anything else we'd encountered. Georgia lasted 3 weeks before quitting research entirely. She sent me a single email. Going back to Austria. My father was right about stable careers. Some things aren't worth studying. I understood completely, but it still felt like another death. 3 weeks after Millbrook, I finally worked up the courage to visit my grandmother's house, the place where I'd grown up after my parents died, where my grandfather's things had sat untouched in the basement for 40 years like a shrine to unfinished business. My grandmother had passed away 2 years earlier, leaving me the house and everything in it. I'd been meaning to clean out the basement forever, but there had always been some excuse. Work, research projects, anything to avoid dealing with family ghosts. Now I needed answers more than I needed to avoid painful memories. The basement smelled like old wood and mothballs and something chemical I couldn't identify, but that reminded me of the mine tunnels. My grandfather's workshop occupied one corner, hand tools organized by size and function, everything exactly where he'd left it 4 decades ago. Even his coffee cup still sat on the workbench, a ring of ancient stains marking where he'd set it down for the last time. But it was the filing cabinet in the back corner that made my heart stop. 3 drawers full of journals, notebooks, and loose papers, all in my grandfather's careful handwriting. Maps of Millbrook from before the mines closed. Radiation readings that matched what we'd found during our expedition. And stories, dozens of them, handwritten accounts dating back generations. My great-grandfather's notes about miners who'd gone missing in the 1940s. Stories from the 1920s about things that shouldn't be, disturbing construction crews. Even older accounts, written in Japanese characters I couldn't read, but somehow understood the meaning of. Warnings about sleeping things beneath mountains, about places where the earth itself was hungry. The pattern went back over a century. My family hadn't just stumbled onto Millbrook by accident. We'd been connected to it for generations, drawn back to the same cursed ground, like iron filings to a magnet. And we'd all known on some level what we were walking into. The final journal entry, dated 3 days before my grandfather's disappearance, was written in English. The radiation levels are consistent with geological surveys, but the source is wrong. This isn't natural uranium decay. It's protecting something that's been sleeping beneath the mountain since before recorded history. The miners have awakened it with their deep excavations, and now it's learning about us, studying our patterns and behaviors. I understand why my father and grandfather came here before me. We're connected to this place in ways I can't fully explain, but the family stories make sense now. Something calls to us, generation after generation, drawing us back to serve as what? Witnesses? Guardians? Food? If I don't return from tomorrow's survey, know that I chose to go anyway. Some secrets are meant to stay buried, but they call to us anyway. Maybe that's our role, to answer when they call, to feed the thing beneath so it doesn't grow hungry enough to hunt beyond the mountain. The compass will always point toward Millbrook. It's been in our family for generations, and it will draw you there eventually, just like it drew me. When that happens, remember that courage and stupidity look identical from the outside. I sat in that basement for hours, reading and rereading journals that explained everything and nothing. My grandfather had known exactly what he was walking into 40 years ago. He'd gone anyway, because something in our family history, some genetic or spiritual obligation, had made the choice for him. And now, that same something was pulling at me. I locked the journals in their filing cabinet and put the key in my pocket, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Bill was still out there somewhere, watching and waiting, protecting the world from something it wasn't ready to understand, keeping guard over secrets that had killed everyone in my family who'd tried to learn them. My grandfather's compass sat on my kitchen table, needle pointing steadily southeast toward mountains I never wanted to see again, but I knew I would, eventually. Some secrets are meant to stay buried, but they call to us anyway.